Hello, everyone. This is Eric Adolovich from the BD School of Business at Simon Fraser University. Many of my colleagues have asked me about how I regard online proctoring in general, and in particular, whether it makes sense to do any online proctoring with Zoom. And up until recently, I was quite skeptical of the prospects because I thought Zoom really wasn't suitable for the task, as it wasn't designed for that purpose. However, recently I've become aware of a technique which involves using a separate device, such as a smartphone, to monitor the environment of the student, and I think that it has some merit. So I decided to make this video to describe it and discuss what's involved and what its advantages are and what are some of its limitations. This approach to proctoring with Zoom is remarkably simple and requires very few things. It requires a laptop that the student will be working on. I guess it could be a desktop computer or some other sort of PC instead, as well as a second device such as a smartphone. And just about every student will have a smartphone. There's no need for a tripod or a stand. A simple book that could be used as a prop, such as The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I'm using in this photo, is perfectly appropriate and reasonable. And you need a relatively small workspace. You can see in the photo, the workstation set up for the student is just a small IKEA table. The smartphone needs to be about 16 inches or more away from the laptop for what needs to be visible via Zoom. To show you what this setup results in from the perspective of somebody watching the student on Zoom, I offered the following photo, and you can see that you can identify the student very clearly. You could look at their face, you can see their hands, you could see the laptop, and you can have a general sense of what their environment is like. And if you choose to ask students to keep their mic on, you could also monitor their sound environment as well. One of the advantages of this approach is that you could fairly easily verify the identity of students so that you could ensure that the person, well, not ensure, but you could take steps to verify that the student who is doing the exam is actually the student who's enrolled in the class. And if you work at a school such as mine, which includes photos of students in class lists, you can cross-reference the photo from the class list database with the student in the photo. And in most cases, you can clearly see whether they're the same person or not. One of the possible drawbacks of this approach of using Zoom is that all the students' video will be visible to all the other students, and I guess that means that it's possible that a student might be able to look at the screen that Zoom is running on and see some of the work that other students are performing on their laptop. To try and mitigate this problem, one of the proctors, either the teacher or some other host, should share their screen, and then the shared screen becomes the foreground, and all the students' videos go into the background as small thumbnail photos, and the size of the thumbnails are such that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for students to be able to see what other students are typing on their screen. I'd like to thank Dr. Rupak Malpatra from Texas A&M for this tip. For an additional layer of security, once the teacher or one of the proctors has been made the host, they can also pin their video as a spotlight video. Again, after they share their screen, this could be done by, clicking on the three dots above the host's video and selecting spotlight video. This means that even if a student were to obtrusively take their device and attempt to pin another student's video or to enlarge the thumbnail of another student, they wouldn't be able to do that. They'd only be able to do that with regard to the host or the proctor's thumbnail video. So that provides an additional layer of security. So let's talk about some of the advantages of this second device or smartphone approach to proctoring with Zoom. First, it uses technology that most students have available and which is familiar to them. It's relatively simple and easy to set up. There's no need for students or instructors to install any additional software on their PCs. They would require the installation of Zoom on their smartphone, if that's the second device that they're using, but nothing on their on their PC, no extensions in Chrome, no software needs to be installed. And that addresses some concerns that students have that universities and instructors are asking them to install, spyware on their PCs. So that's not an issue with this approach. It uses relatively simple and familiar technology, so demystifies the process for people. People know what's going on. There's no fears about AI or biometrics being taken. It's just simple Zoom technology that most people use every day. It's a low cost or even no cost solution for students and institutions, particularly those that have already made investments in Zoom licenses for the purposes of instruction. It works very well with low bandwidth connections, which is advantageous for people who might be located in parts of the world where internet connections are spotty or not particularly robust. It captures the immediate work environment of students, but is not very intrusive. In fact, the students can set it up and with enough advance notice, set it up in a particular way and in a particular place where they're not disclosing any more information about themselves and their surroundings than they feel comfortable in doing. It could be used with or without audio monitoring, depending upon the desire and the needs of the instructor. You can record sessions or not, depending upon whether Zoom recording is allowed at your institution and whether it's necessary. In fact, it might not always be necessary to record sessions because it allows fairly close observation of students. It kind of mimics or emulates the situation that you might find in a classroom examination setting, which is not a context where video recording is typically taking place. Finally, used with archive photos, such as the class list photo I showed earlier, it can be used to help verify the identity of test takers, which significantly mitigates the risk of contract cheating. In terms of specific suggestions for use, I would suggest that instructors who want to use this approach notify students at the beginning of their course that smartphone Zoom proctoring will be used. I think it's important to explain why it's going to be used, explain how it's going to work, explain when it's going to be used so that students can be prepared in terms of the technical requirements and having the facilities and having the space available to do the assessment. And there should be a specification of the requirements, such as whether you're going to ask students to keep their sound on and what specifically you want to be visible in the Zoom I also suggest that instructors remind students to plug in and charge their phone and adjust settings so that the phone doesn't shut down in the middle of the session. I think it's also important that instructors set up at least one dry run in a very low stakes or no stakes setting so that students become familiar with the process, so they're not stressed out too much when they have to use this approach in medium or high stakes settings. Ideally, the smaller the group, the better, but probably the upper limit of the number of students that could be proctored at one time by one person is probably about 50 students. I suggest that breakout rooms in Zoom be used so that as small groups as possible can be monitored with dedicated proctors. I think it's also important to create additional breakout rooms in Zoom in case you need to speak to an individual student during the exam. For instance, if you weren't completely satisfied that the person writing the exam was the same person that you saw in the archive photo, or perhaps because you saw a student or two doing things that might be somewhat suspicious, and you might want to put them in a separate room with a dedicated proctor so that they're being able to, you're able to observe their activities a little bit closer for the remainder of the exam. I think it's also valuable to ask proctors to shut off their cameras so as to be less intrusive and to leave it unclear when students are being watched. Shutting off the cameras so that people aren't staring at students when they're doing their exam will probably make it a lot less creepy and intrusive for the students. And I think that that's important. You want students to be as comfortable, and you want the proctoring environment to be as worry-free and unobtrusive as possible. Lastly, I suggest that if possible, you should use student assistants to monitor the breakout rooms and move between rooms to monitor the proctors in the testing environments yourself as the instructor of record for the course. Lastly, I want to offer some disclaimers. First, and perhaps most important, I'm not advocating for the use of this technique or for remote proctoring of exams or tests in general. I strongly believe that decisions about how to assess students are best made by instructors themselves in line with the academic policies and resources of their school, as well as any applicable laws or regulations. My second disclaimer is that nothing is perfect. Determined and resourceful individuals will always find a way to cheat no matter what safeguards are put in place, whether it's in class or online. And in this regard, the goal is to mitigate and not completely eliminate cheating by making it more difficult, expensive, uncertain, and risky for those who might be tempted to engage in such a behavior, and to create as fair a testing environment as possible for honest and hardworking students. And I think that the Zoom proctoring approach does that to some extent. Also, though it's relatively easy to implement, this technique does add some additional work and an additional layer of complexity for students and instructors. Unfortunately, proctoring is felt to be necessary by many people, and this entails some additional work and perhaps an opportunity for a little bit of distraction as well. This is the nature of the beast and the cost of online education and assessment, and perhaps it's necessary in the environment that we're currently working in. Lastly, I'll say that it does not eliminate the need for good assessment design, and that instructors still need to consider what are the right types of questions and assessment instruments to use to measure their learning goals with integrity, and it also complements rather than replaces the need for other tools and approaches such as randomized question banks or open book exams. So it's not a panacea. However, it could be a useful tool and a useful approach to help instructors provide a fair learning environment and to mitigate the potential for cheating and to decrease the temptation that some students might have to engage in such behavior. I hope that this short video has provided some ideas for instructors about how they might be able to use Zoom to proctor assessments in a way that works in terms of their learning goals and works in terms of the needs of their students. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye from Eric Adolovich at Simon Fraser University.